So women in Fiji that I interviewed were very proud of their church membership and proud of the way that being a member of the church helped them uh, overstep their culture and be women that could speak out and speak their minds and had a voice that didn't have to follow the conventional rules of their hairstyles and their dress. They could choose those for themselves, how to interact with the opposite gender, eating together with their families, and also standing up to domestic violence. There was no crossover between these responses and the responses I was getting in Utah and New Zealand. So when I asked the same question in Utah and New Zealand, women, the majority of the women, are really the only consensus that came out of that is that women were thankful for their church membership in the way that they felt supported and respected in their roles as stay-at-home mothers, which is a respect that they didn't feel like they were getting from outside of the church culture. So both the Fijian women and the women from the US and New Zealand valued their church membership for helping them differentiate themselves from their outside culture. They just had different contexts and values around which this meaning was working for them in their lives. Now I'd like to talk about this question of, does church membership help you create an equal partnership with your husband? All of the participants were very aware of this teaching from the church. And in Fiji, the resounding answer was yes. There was 100% saturation around the idea that the church membership helped them create an equal partnership with their husbands. The consensus among the US women was also 100%, and it was 100% ambivalence. So the answers I was getting all were basically like this. That's a hard question. So as I asked the women I was talking with to explain this to me or to give me examples, some other interesting ideas came up. Fijian women started telling me that they actually did have some ambivalence about whether their church membership was helping them in the situations where they had men that were serving in church leadership positions. So for example, in Fiji, the church helps create equal partnerships except for those women whose husbands are in leadership. They struggle with it, I do. And another woman, right now, I question whether being a bishop is actually taking him away from our family, so sometimes my testimony is not as strong. So this is how, just a summary slide of how the Fijian women answered this question. To contrast that, the US women came down looking like this. So in the US, as we discussed this issue more in depth, there was a lot of feelings and comments that came out around the feeling that church membership sometimes made it harder for couples to have an equal partnership in situations where the man was in church leadership. For example, the stake president said, "I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Your husband will be off having spiritual experiences and you're going to be home with the kids and alone." This woman was talking about something that was hard in her own relationship. Another woman, "The church needs him more than it needs me." Another woman, "Because of my dad's calling, my mom is my dad's tag-along and she'd never in a million years complain about it, but I will complain for her." So Fijian women looked like this, and it was parallel in contrast to the US women who looked like this. The next question I'd like to talk about is this question: have you noticed any differences in the temple between men and women? So by the time this question came up in the US interviews, this had already been answered. The US women were very excited to talk with me about the 2019 updates and how relieved they were about those updates. So there was 100% saturation around this idea, a lot of excitement around it. Definitely came up without any prompting from me very early in the interviews. So this idea, it was somehow portrayed that men had a stronger bond with God, but now it seems so much more direct. I love it. That was the feeling of most of the women, was approval for the changes and relief. How did women in Fiji answer this question? They said things like, "It's just the clothing. It's the seating arrangement. yes, I noticed the difference between the men and the women. If you can see the card, us girls, it's pink. For men, it's blue. There's no difference of how they do the ordinance, the things inside. The only thing that is different there is the color of the card. So I was hearing these answers and I wondered, were Fijian women untouched by the differences that were so present in the minds of the US women? Or were the Fijian women more reticent about speaking about them? So I asked some follow-up questions such as, is there anything else, any other differences you've noticed at all? When I asked this, a majority of the Fijian women talked about the order. So they would mention this idea that church functions by Heavenly Father speaking to the priesthood, and they speak to us. And then this feeling that there's nothing wrong with this line of communication. Men are more important because of their callings. I feel special as a woman. This is the meaning they took from this difference that they saw. The order is only for this life. I would do a good job if Heavenly Father directed that to me. There were a couple women who had opposing views. One woman in particular said that she went through a hard time and told her husband, I don't want to be exalted anymore. I started wanting to explore life without the temple. However, she'd resolve these issues with time. So as I was hearing these answers from the women, it made me wonder if the 2019 updates had happened in Fiji or not, since all of the women seemed to be talking about things in a different way from how the US women were talking about them and referring to things that were previous to the changes. So I asked them if the changes, if anything had happened or if any updates had happened. And at this point, with prompting from me, it came up. And women said things like this: I'm very satisfied with the changes. The temple is shorter. I didn't know of any changes. Oh, wait. The 1 hour session. Yeah, we have the 1 hour session in Fiji. It's shorter now, which is good. Now more people will want to join the church. So the 2019 updates made a different impact in the US than they did in Fiji. And although the Fijian women were aware, they took the same meanings from the differences in the temple before the 2019 updates. Those differences were much less troubling to them, to the point that the 2019 updates for them were more important by shortening the length of the ceremony than by changing the content. For most of the women. There was one woman that had a different view. So that was very different in Fiji, to have one woman with a slightly nuanced view versus in the US where 100% saturation of relief and enthusiasm for these changes. So to summarize, today I've talked about these topics. I won't be talking about the other ones, save it for another time. Weaknesses in this research project: I am an outsider in Fiji. I am more of an insider in New Zealand and in the US. The Fijian women were speaking to me using English as a second language, and one could argue that each of these locations where I was working are unique and anomalous geographic pockets. Strengths of this research are that I brought insider sensitivity and insider access. Also, there was high participant buy-in. There was a real warmth between me and the women that I was asking questions to. And I feel that my evidence and my conclusions are reproducible. Thank you for listening.